Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Today we have a wonderful all-star panel to discuss some fascinating issues that arise from Danielle Citron's new book, The Fight for Privacy. This is a superb book, and it really couldn't be more timely. It really captures some of the most pressing issues of the day. I think Danielle must have seen the future because I can't imagine a better timed book that's really touching on some of the most important issues that we're facing right now. And to keep our time, I'm going to forego introducing everybody because everybody's names are up here, and I've described everybody's bio in all of the background information for this event. So I'd like to just launch into it and start with you, Danielle. Can you very briefly, tell us about some of the key themes in your book and what your book's about?
So the book is about intimate privacy, the privacy that sort of information and access to our bodies, our health, our innermost thoughts, our sexual orientation, sexual activities, our gender, and our closest relationships. So it's all the ways that we manage the boundaries around intimate life. And at the core of the book is an argument that we ought to understand intimate privacy as a foundational good, that each and every one enjoys us. We should view it as a fundamental human right and also a civil right. So that that we all enjoy intimate privacy, but it has special protections against discrimination, and that we ought to view anyone holding our intimate data as the guardians, the stewards of that intimate data. We all need it to flourish, to love, to figure out who we are, and we need it to have a full sense of ourselves, right, as fully integrated people rather than as just fragments of ourselves. And so that's the core, of the book is this fight for intimate privacy and what it can do for all of us, privacy as we, not me.
So one of the issues that you spend a lot of time talking about in the book is content moderation online and some of the vicious attacks and harassment of people, especially women online. And you and Marianne have done a lot of really path-breaking work to address this issue. And right now we're seeing, I think, some real troubling developments on that front with what's going on Twitter, as well as attempts by state legislatures, in particular Texas, to try to stop websites from engaging in content moderation to protect people. But I'd like to just start generally, if you could describe a little bit about, in your book, some of the issues regarding that, some of the threats that are faced online, especially by women.
So, when Mary and I began writing about non-consensual intimate imagery, it was not that it wasn't pervasive. It's just there were at the time, so 2013 and 14, my RAs and I could find 40 sites devoted to the practice of non-consensual intimate imagery. So they're not very creative in the names of these sites, but hidden cam, hidden camera, right? But now here we are, it's 2022. And as hard as we've been working with, Marianne has done this most extraordinary job with lawmakers across the country and at the federal level. But, we made some progress when it comes to law. But 2022, here we are, there are 9,500 sites devoted to the practice of hidden cam. So you go from 40, right? So now there are 9,500. And Section 230 of the Decency Act is what allows them to, sort of unimpeded, without concern about, lawsuits, they get to internalize all of the profits, right? They often are subscription models, right? They sell and collect data, and they don't have to internalize any of the harms that they externalize. And so, a lot of the work around intimate privacy for us, right, Marianne, and I'm gonna probably lob it, if it's okay, over to you to, think about. But we both, together we've been working with industry to influence norms around the taking, the sharing, the extortion, deepfakery around like non-consensual intimate imagery, and we've made some progress, right? Like and maybe I don't know if Marianne, you want to take over a discussion of the hash database, kind of our image for a broader shared hash database. And because, as Dan asks, like, what's the content moderation, those pressing issues? So if it's okay, Dan, is it okay? I'm not the moderator, but you said, like, go ahead. I'm going to lob the hot potato to my partner in crime, or as we say, my partner in deterring crime, Marianne.
All right, hope you can hear me okay. I've been having a little bit of technical issues, but yeah, thank you, Danielle. And I think, one of the things that I think Danielle's work crystallizes so elegantly is the way that we have for such a long time as a society, not only not seen privacy as a matter of intimacy in many respects, but particularly when it comes to women's privacy, it's been more than the opposite, right? That we think of exploiting women and especially their bodies and exposing them to the public as a form of entertainment. And that's something pretty unique and sort of gender driven. It's not gender exclusive, right? Anyone can become a victim of sexual exploitation, but there's a very strong, long history here of using the invasion of women's privacy as a kind of entertainment, a blood sport. And it's really difficult to push back, not just on those social norms, because of course we're dealing with problems that people want to engage in, first of all, right? There are so many things you don't have to legislate so strongly around because people don't do them for whatever reason, but people really want to exploit women's privacy. And it's often coded as freedom of expression, or it's some kind of, it's considered sort of, I don't know, it's some kind of sexual practice in itself to engage in these kinds of abuses. And so a huge part of the struggle has been to get people to understand women's privacy, not as something to be exploited, but as something to be protected, and to try to erode that sense of entitlement that people have to women's bodies in particular, and then get the law to catch up, because the law is not really thinking about this as a problem, has always undercounted harms to women, has always been built for the people who are in power. And technology companies have just followed that, right? It's not an innovation of the tech industry to exploit women for profit. It's something that even often happens just by default, not even by intention. It just happens by default. So trying to push back on all that, trying to move the framework, that's really the beginning part of that task.
Now, Allyson?
Yeah, and I think that the way Danielle describes the CDA as being something that is, it was supposed to be designed for self-moderation, for good Samaritans, and instead it's now protecting against websites that are choosing just not to do anything good at all. And I think that it's definitely time to look back at what it was originally designed for, and whether it's still something that we need at this stage in the development of the internet.
Do you think anything is possible to change with Section 230? I believe there's now a case in the Supreme Court. It could be that, perhaps some of the precedent that expanded the meaning of 230 beyond what its words say could be perhaps rolled back. The famous Ziran case, Ziran versus AOL. And I'm wondering what you think might happen, or does anyone have a sense of or a guess of what's going to happen? I really can't predict it. I have no idea what the court's going to think about this.
I have so many thoughts, so many concerns, because this is something, as Danielle often says, if you were trying to talk to people 5 years ago, 10 years ago about changing CDA 230, they look at you like you're crazy. And now all of a sudden, not only has there been all this pushback, but also now we're getting a Supreme Court case to review the scope of Section 230. And we would be delighted if the reason why we have come to the historical point is because the lessons have been learned about who is being harmed by this, how much this is really providing, Section 230's interpretation is providing a kind of corporate dominance over people's lives, their conceptions of freedom of speech, their ability to live their lives, and But it's not just that. There's a very politicized, really unnerving sort of backlash against big tech for doing the very things that Danielle and I often think are the right things for companies to do. So companies are finally, belatedly, minimally, starting to respond to things like non-consensual pornography and harassment and white supremacy. And the moment they start doing that, suddenly there is a political faction that used to be incredibly fond of the free market and everybody making their own choices, that is now bound and determined to stop that and is willing to trample the First Amendment, to trample private liberty, to do anything they can to try to punish big tech companies for doing the least amount possible that they could to try to get some of this extremism and exploitation off of their platform. So we're in a really troubling moment. So I am both excited about the possibility of the Supreme Court reviewing the scope of Section 230, because I think the path of Zarin and its progeny is completely wrong. And I would love it if the court would actually take a close look at the text and history of Section 230 and restore it to where it should be. That is, exactly as Allyson was saying, to a Good Samaritan statute. But I'm very nervous that this is an excuse for the court to try to attack that other, to attack the very Good Samaritan part of the statute, which is we want you to take things down if it is objectionable or if it is harmful in some kind of way. So I'm very nervous about where this is headed.
So Elon Musk took over Twitter and has been making some radical changes with its content moderation. In particular, he's decimating what Twitter had built up. And this, I think, raises some interesting issues. To some extent, we often don't want to put all our trust in a company to protect people. We want the law to try to say, hey, this is what is appropriate if a company has a different vision. On the other hand, there are states that are saying, well, the internet's like a public mall or a public forum, and we should prevent them from stopping certain speech and actually prevent content moderation. Texas has passed a law trying to do that. So this is a tension because it's kind of like devils in every corner to some extent. Do you want the companies making these decisions and you get folks like Musk making their choices? If you look to the law, how do you stop the law from going in the wrong direction? What's the answer here?
What I really want to emphasize about that is the troubling thing about the kind of conversation now about, well, do we want these big companies to decide? If the answer is we don't, we must understand they've always been deciding. What is so suspect for me right now is that when they were deciding that Nazis were fine and that we want to make every social media platform a playground for white supremacists and misogynists, there was so little pushback when they were making choices to platform all of that content. And it's only at the moment where they're choosing to maybe not platform some of it very much or a little bit less that that's really brought up this kind of tension. So I really want to make sure that we understand this. When I said this about the Texas and Florida laws trampling on the First Amendment, the part of the First Amendment that's so much less popular and talked about is that for private individuals and companies, not for the government, and I know everybody on this call knows this, but it gets lost. When you're talking about the government, we don't want them to be making all kinds of decisions, micromanaging what can be said and what cannot be said, because they're the government. But the opposite is true when it comes to private individuals. We want to make choices about who we allow inside our homes, inside our classrooms, inside our restaurants, our nightclubs, all of these spaces. Places that don't actually engage in some kind of filtering or some kind of quality standards or some kind of minimal standards of decency for behavior at in their environments are chaotic places that nobody wants to be. And that's exactly what a lot of these platforms have become. And when they are engaging in this ability to kick people out, just like when a restaurant owner says, to a patron who has started to scream racial slurs in the middle of the restaurant, that restaurant owner has the right, and in some ways an obligation, to kick that person out. So what we forget sometimes is that the First Amendment isn't just about what we are giving access to, what we are promoting. It's the things we choose to say, actually, no, I don't want you here. I don't want to be associated with your speech. I want to make my own decisions about what kinds of quality standards we want to have, what kinds of accuracy policies we want to have. Those are good things. And for a long time, Republicans, conservatives also thought those were good things. And their reason for changing now is not a good reason. So I really want to emphasize that about private individuals, non-state actors. We should be fully supportive of their First Amendment right to say no to certain types of content. Whether we like those decisions or not, they have the right to do that.
I think that's exactly right. It's the idea that by not doing anything, you are somehow allowing just free speech all across the platform. It's just completely false. When your behavioral advertising model itself has algorithms that, you know, put certain speech above others already, the idea that you're saying, no, I'm not going to moderate the content is just false. It's going to happen for you, whether you do or not. But I love the way that Elon Musk is so for free speech until it's actually critical of him. So it's very interesting.
And Danielle, you had a really interesting argument that you've made a number of times about how the speech valence, the overall speech valence, is not so clear when, you know, sometimes restricting speech promotes speech and sometimes other speech chills people. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how some of the harassment and speech online actually drives speakers offline and silences people?
So when I first began writing about online abuse, recall, Dan, you know, the very first privacy law scholars conference in 2008, right? The very notion that I said, listen, online harassment and cyber mobs silence people. They drive them offline. When you're under assault, there is just it's both stupid and impossible to stay online, because essentially, you know, anything you say is going to be used against you, and your privacy is going to be invaded many times over if you stick around. Now, I made that assertion. We were, you know, thinking about and leaning hard on ways in which Kitty McKinnon had written about sexual harassment in the workplace, right? All that kind of silencing dynamic that feminists have long written about, right? But now we have clear empirical proof, and not just from the United States, from around the globe, that intimate privacy violations and cyber gender harassment silence speech. It's now irrefutable. We've got speech costs. You know, we often say, like, the hypothetical notion of doing anything to Section 230 will break the internet. Like, we're going to lose all this speech. That's a hypothetical assertion. We don't know what would actually happen, but we do know now, in the here and the now, that there are civil rights and civil liberties on the line. By doing the status quo is really costly for the free speech of individuals whose intimate privacy is violated, who are beset by cyber mobs. And so basically you have to just shut everything down. So I feel like, at least, what do they say? It's depressing to note that 10 or 12 years later, you know, like, now we've got the empirical proof from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, South Korea, right? We've got all these empirical studies. So sadly, we know that intimate privacy violations and other forms of online abuse silences speech. I wish it wasn't the case, but we now have empirical proof of what was then like just an assertion. Right now we know.
Yeah, and many countries don't have 230. I mean, we do. Many countries don't. But, you know, last time I checked, they have internet. So, you know, and people are actually able to communicate online without 230. I'd like to shift the topic to another topic that you discuss in your book, which is the surveillance society that we live in. You talk a lot about how we have massive data collection by companies and apps. And this data collection involves intimate privacy, information about people's health and everything about their lives. And we are now in a post-Dobbs world. The Supreme Court this year struck down the right to abortion, something I like to call the right to reproductive autonomy. Elizabeth, you wrote something really interesting about how we're not just returned to a pre-Roe versus Wade world. We're not returned. The world is very different than it was back in 1972. Now, without the protections of Roe, we might be in a much worse spot. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you were getting at in that piece?
Sure. I mean, I think once after Dobbs, once the states are free to criminalize abortion and everything around abortion, and that means that the police can investigate abortion just like they can investigate any other kind of crime. And I think that's really the most, I think, hardest thing for a lot of folks to wrap their minds around. Because when abortion is a crime, when it's criminalized, that means that law enforcement can use all of the tools available to them to investigate it. And that, of course, includes the traditional methods like surveillance in a physical sense, or informants or tips. But the problem is, today, when we're in 2022, all of us are spending 10, 12 hours online every single day. That's where we're living our lives, and we're leaving all these digital breadcrumbs everywhere. And I think, what Danielle has observed so well, is that most of us are pretty helpless when it comes to controlling that information, and of course, reproductive rights are part of intimacy rights. And we really have not just no control very often over where that information is going. We very often have no idea what information is being collected or who has access to it. And so at the end of the day, we're left in this world where some states are beginning to take some action, my own state of California. But mostly it seems like the advice is self-help. But I think that digital self-help is completely inadequate, because I think the main, the main observation that we can take from this is, just as abortion itself, pre-Dobbs, abortion access was never equal. It's also the case that criminal abortion enforcement and how folks are able to sort of help themselves is also going to be unequal, right? And that's really the concern.
I'd love to point out too there that, going back to Marianne's point about the ownership of women's bodies historically, and kind of this feeling of entitlement to women's bodies culturally and historically, really comes into play here as well. And I think, a lot of folks are saying these state laws, they're targeting providers. It's fine. It's just not going to bother women. And I just, I want to point out the work of Leslie Regan, When Abortion Was a Crime. And you can see that historically, even when laws have targeted providers, women's bodies are the scene of the crime. Data about women is what makes the case against providers. So even when you have laws targeting providers, you're going to end up with significant surveillance of women. And also, I would just say too, looking at the pre-Roe versus post-Dobbs, we're really going to see, look, these laws they're passing, they're trying to drive providers out of the states, and they will do that. You can see the clinics that are shutting down in the states that have these laws, but they're not going to stop abortion from happening. And we're going to see the use of medication abortion and the rise of self-managed abortion. And that is going to, in turn, lead to even greater surveillance of women, of women's data, of women's bodies. And so this is the thing that I think has been fascinating about this case in the privacy area, is that people have thought of Griswold and Roe as these decisional autonomy cases. But Griswold mentioned, what are we going to do? Go under the beds of all these married couples? That's the kind of surveillance. No, you can't criminalize the use of contraception. That's where we're headed, because this is implicating not just decisional autonomy, not just physical bodily integrity, which it absolutely is implicating, but it is implicating informational privacy, intellectual privacy, associational privacy, all coming back to this very intimate data that goes back to the control, ownership, and entitlement to control women's bodies. It's a really frightening situation.
And I think that's right. And one other thing I would add is, once abortion gets folded into what policing is about, you sort of realize, two things. Number one, and there's a lot of uncertainty, for a lot of people about what that means when they have to be careful in terms of abortion, criminal abortion enforcement. And the other, not pretty open secret about policing on policing and the law is that there's an enormous amount of discretion. Even if there are laws, they are not evenly enforced across the board. And again, to go back to my earlier point about inequality, I think it's pretty predictable, even if there are, abortion cases, how they're going to play out. They're not going to play out very differently than even those, on the border cases that we saw pre-Dobbs, where a very aggressive prosecutors were going to go against, women who were low-income women from communities of color. They were least able to protect themselves in all of the respects that Jolynn just brought up. And in this post-Dobbs world, it's not really clear, what kinds of protections they can assert or avail themselves of. And we're sort of in this, number one, a world of digital uncertainty in terms of our information. We're living in a kind of uncertain world of cross-border wars where states are kind of competing with and against each other in terms of who is going to have exercise control outside of their borders. All of that, of which is a totally unknown question about the constitutionality of their ability to do that. And so if you're a person who is just even theoretically concerned about protecting their own reproductive rights, there aren't a good set of options about what that means, unless you sort of never do anything. And in a way, this is the silencing sort of in the physical world that Danielle's talking about.
Allyson, you wrote a really interesting piece about discovery post-Dobbs. And there definitely could be a lot of interesting avenues on not just what the government can get, which I definitely would love to discuss with you all more and hopefully will, but also just what private parties can get and the information. And you can easily see states passing laws saying that, allowing, the father to sue or other types of laws that would then enable, getting this information from a subpoena or through some mechanism of discovery. And I'm just curious if you could just explain a little bit more about the piece and just how readily data can be gathered, and then what are ways that it can be protected or stopped from being gathered in this way.
Right. So I've looked at discovery in civil cases and not really even focused on where the case itself may involve abortion or reproductive rights, but where the case touches on something else, but the discovery itself can be so broad that it can implicate some of these intimate privacy concerns that Danielle talks about, because discovery itself has become very broad and includes social media, includes cell phones. We have parties who try to get forensic review of cell phones. It includes Fitbits and other kinds of information from the Internet of Things. And discovery it's largely party driven, and the only real limitations on it in Rule 26 are that it's relevant, and then supposedly that it's proportional. And so these issues come up where the parties themselves are going back and forth. And yeah, if there's a dispute, it comes before the court that has a lot of discretion as to whether to enter protective orders or things like that. What I worry about is that the ability to get this kind of information can itself chill people from exercising their rights to bring lawsuits and otherwise maybe settle before they when they wouldn't otherwise. So in cases where litigants, for example, sue for sexual harassment, we've seen other parties trying to get information about their any kinds of activities with other sexual partners or things like that in order to show reasonableness of what the defendant thought or something. And while we have some kind of forward-looking judges who will maybe use federal rules of evidence, 412, the rape shield law, as something that should also limit discovery, the truth is it's not limited. That all that is required is that it be relevant and somehow proportional. And so I see a lot of problems with how broad discovery has been. Just like in a lot of areas, judges are much slower on the uptake with respect to technology in these areas. And early on, when people were seeking social media information, judges thought, well, wait, social media, there's no right to privacy there, and give them your password. And slowly we've gotten away from that, but there's still a lot of problems where you're in an area where there is no privacy. If a diary entry is relevant, it's discoverable. So it's I think going to be really difficult moving forward to make sure that discovery is cabined. The existing protections, some courts have pointed to Roe v. Wade and other decisional privacy cases as being limitations on discovery. And so I think that Dobbs will affect that. Other courts have looked at the information privacy confidentiality wing, which, as I've written, I fear that's the next shoe to drop anyway. But I think that, courts have looked at that wing in particular for medical privacy. A lot of courts of appeals have found a right to not have to disclose certain medical information in discovery based on those decisions. Otherwise, we have reliance on some of the statutory publication shelters in federal law, HIPAA, FOIA, some of those protections. And then, of course, there's always state law. So state constitutional privacy provisions and other laws like that. So I hope that there is enough out there that courts will protect based on those existing laws. I think that there's still a lot of room for improvement. And I think it's up to the litigants themselves to be aware of it and to put the pressure on each other not to allow these overbroad requests, and educating the judges about what is involved, how much is involved in a cell phone. And courts have also looked at recent Fourth Amendment case law that shows just how invasive location information and all that kind of stuff that's available on apps and phones, et cetera, et cetera. So, all of it, I think they're aware. We just need to push back.
So HIPAA, you mentioned HIPAA, and I some have kind of looked to the direction of the Department of Health and Human Services, which issued some guidance on HIPAA. I think, unfortunately, HIPAA is not particularly that strong. I don't know if someone wants to opine on, how good is HIPAA as a means to protect this kind of information. Do you have any thoughts about it? I'm happy to weigh in quickly on it if no one wants. Marianne?
One thing that I've been thinking about is, and this is again partly what Danielle's framework is, which is all the ways in which we trust sources or we assume certain things about sources. Because HIPAA, as I know Dan knows so well, the covered entity, right? That is, who does this actually apply to? Who's got a duty to keep things confidential? It's not very broad. It's in fact extremely narrow. So if you've got some kind of level of trust, or at least a sort of a non-paranoid view of the information that you might be typing into a search engine or into a period tracker, or for that matter, and this is a big one, right? Going to something called a crisis pregnancy center and thinking that you're going to either get some kind of medical help or that this is confidential. And of course, what is the really convenient thing about the pregnancy crisis centers is not just that they're anti-abortion operations, but they're not medical facilities, but they make people think they are. So not only are you tricking people into thinking they're going to get medically sound advice, they're also not a covered entity under HIPAA. So if they take your information, they now have a record of you looking into some questions about pregnancy, possibly abortion, and now they have no obligation not to disclose it. So I'm really concerned about all the ways that HIPAA is just not, unless it were radically changed, it simply isn't going to be the solution here.
Yeah, and even if HIPAA were to apply, it's incredibly weak when it comes to law enforcement access to information. and generally other kinds of access to information. It provides the most minimal of protections. It basically allows it with a subpoena. So we go back to what Allyson said about essentially like, rules of discovery to some extent, and it doesn't restrict that. Which also brings us to the Fourth Amendment. We're in a interesting time with the Fourth Amendment. For a long time, the Supreme Court had what was called the third party doctrine, where records held by third parties were deemed not a reasonable expectation of privacy. So there was no Fourth Amendment protection there. The Supreme Court never really took a medical privacy case or really looked at intimate privacy on that, I think because it didn't want to make that kind of a holding. But ultimately, it started to pull back from the very strong vision of the third party doctrine. In Carpenter said that, location data, cell site location information did give rise to a reasonable expectation of privacy because it's so extensive. But we still have a lot of open questions because the third party doctrine still exists. And I'm wondering, how does it apply here? And how would it apply to some of the kinds of information that would affect reproductive autonomy or generally, intimate privacy information?
I feel like we have some amazing Fourth Amendment scholars here, but I just wanted, so I'm not going to tackle that, but I wanted to say that, the sort of the invisible handshake between government and private parties, in particular data brokers, is so fraught with, really significant risk for anyone who's capable of a pregnancy today. That is, either location data brokers, affording location data brokers. Right now, the contracts with governments, like government is the biggest, law enforcement is the biggest customer of data brokers. And so, Barry Friedman and I are kind of joining forces to think about, well, what kind of statutory regime could we have to ensure that data brokers act like data stewards vis-a-vis government, and who should be holding intimate data. But it's an area that I think we almost loop around the Fourth Amendment as if it's irrelevant. So I'm going to now defer. I'm looking at you guys, my brilliant Fourth Amendment scholars here. But in a way, like that is the Fourth Amendment is just absolutely as if it's bypassed. It's meaningless when you can just purchase it from data brokers. But it's so I'm going to now throw it to my friends. What is the meaning? How can the Fourth Amendment stand as a bulwark or crucible to protect us?
I think the short answer, it doesn't. I think you're right. I mean, I think one of the biggest issues is not actually the third party doctrine, but what you've just mentioned, Danielle, and that is the government as a customer in more of the surveillance economy. And even if you talk to, as I'm sure you have, well-meaning government officials, they just say, look, there's no guidelines at all. So we're just going to do whatever we want. And so what is the point of going through the normal processes when you can purchase gigantic tranches of information? You can simply get a subscription, a literal subscription to some of these databases, which are accessible even to small and medium law enforcement agencies. So what you really have is kind of everybody's a customer in the information marketplace, including law enforcement. And the Fourth Amendment has nothing to say about that. The Supreme Court has zero interest in tackling that at the moment. And that means that all that information is vulnerable. And what I'd also add, Dan, is just like the really ordinary doctrines of the Fourth Amendment come into play here too. We're talking about people who are in very vulnerable psychological and health situations. Doctrines like consent. Can I take a look at your phone? Do you mind where are you going? Let me ask you some questions. These are not situations where people feel like, well, I'm going to walk away and not talk to you. We all know how those situations play out in the context of drug enforcement or other kinds of sort of street crimes. But again, once you fold abortion into that world, since the Fourth Amendment is sort of trans-substantive, it applies across the board, we're going to see that kind of dynamic play out as well. So we can talk about the digital marketplace, and we should, but don't forget that this just plays out in the most ordinary of ways in just person-to-person interactions too.
Now, I would just throw out too about the proposal of the Fourth Amendment is not for sale act. And something like that could be really helpful. And I certainly think that's true anytime you're dealing with health data and health policy. So a similar issue came up with COVID, right? And contact tracing apps that would collect health information. And honestly, you want people to use contact tracing apps. You want people to participate in any social activity that's going to inhibit an epidemic, a pandemic. But if doing so puts their data at risk, you can't ask them to do that. So Fourth Amendment is not for sale, I think could have helped in that situation and certainly in this situation. And anytime you criminalize a bodily process, you're going to discourage people from seeking the health care that they need. And that's going to drive up maternal mortality. It's going to drive up infant mortality and bad outcomes altogether. But on that Fourth Amendment point too, I just think, the article that Stephanie Pell wrote with me on the impotence of the Fourth Amendment is really going along the same lines that Elizabeth said. Once you criminalize this bodily event, it will become impossible in many ways to rely on this protection from unreasonable searches. If someone can just gather information, which it may help them, the third party doctrine, gather information here and there to build probable cause, go get a warrant and ask for your mobile device. Use a mobile device extraction technique. Sure, they can go directly to the company. Sure, they can also buy this information. But once it's criminalized, it's just hard to understand how the Fourth Amendment is going to actually protect women in this situation who will be investigated as part of these alleged violations. So I've been really interested to see the attempt in California to say, no, we're not going to help you. We're not going to answer your warrants. We're not going to respond. And our people and our companies here in California are not going to be able to respond to a warrant from another state seeking to penalize somebody for doing something that's lawful here in California. I think that's a fascinating response. And I'm interested in anyone here's analysis of what's going to happen when two states come into conflict with each other.
Yeah, I wonder, can you do that? Because it always is the case where, states, everybody cooperates with law enforcement in other states. But if states stop cooperating, can a state do that even? Is it constitutional to do that? What are the downstream implications of states, which disagree with the criminal law of other states, not cooperating with those authorities? I mean, I've never seen any precedent for this. I honestly don't know the constitutional implications of it. But it's a really interesting, question.
One thing to think about, as a kind of a parallel here is, the kinds of moves we've seen states make in I guess right now politically popular senses. That is, the number of states who have said we're not going to obey gun laws, right? So, the government can do whatever it wants and we're going to do our own things. I think that, the answer may be the same, right? And it's a good test case because it just happens to be that many people who might be alarmed at the notion of abortion becoming a crime might not be in the same camp as the people who are maybe facing a certain direction on gun laws. So this question of surveillance, I always wonder about when there's a bad move towards surveillance or towards any kind of policy, trying to figure out who you can kind of navigate to your side by getting them to understand that it would affect them and an issue that they care about, right? So if you can track women because abortion is now a crime, what does that mean for tracking people having a registry for gun owners and making sure that we understand wherever you're going and whenever you went to a gun store and sat for 30 minutes, or to try to think about, some of these perhaps different cultural scenarios. So I do think it's interesting to see how that will play out and whether we want it to play out in a certain way, given that whatever rules supposedly we establish for one case should maybe hold in another. But I just wanted to also add to both Elizabeth and Jolynn's points about the effect that this is going to have on, again, that the Fourth Amendment isn't so much the issue as it is the depression of reporting of certain crimes. So in addition to the fact that you criminalize women's bodies and you criminalize something that they do with their bodies, what that will do for mortality rates, but what it will do for the reporting of domestic violence, what it's going to do to the reporting of sexual assault, what it's going to do to the reporting of non-consensual pornography, which is already pretty complicated for people. So what's one of the first things you're going to need to do? You report something like, he's been exposing these photos that I have on my phone. Give us your phone, right? Now they have your phone, and it's part of the process of you trying to report something that's happened to you. Or I want to report domestic violence. I've recorded him and it's on my phone. The way that surveillance machinery is going to completely chill the ability of people, vulnerable individuals who are seeking help from desperate situations or to report crimes, I really do think we just haven't even begun to understand the sheer scale of that, and how many nonprofits are going, and other organizations are also going to have to come up with their own new set of practices. I'm thinking about the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative that Danielle and I both work for. We're given sensitive data all the time. And so the question is, what happens if we get a subpoena, right? There's so many interlocking questions of, okay, my ex is threatening to post these pictures and he knows I had an abortion, or he knows I'm thinking about it. Now we've got like multiple things we have to worry about, and there's information being given to us in a spirit of trust. So it's complicating things on so many different levels, on so many different sort of metrics, and so many of them having to intersect precisely, as many of the panelists have already pointed out, for communities that were already incredibly vulnerable.
And I also think here too that, as far as people who want to help, I think the cross-border problems, the digital surveillance economy that we live in, it makes that kind of attempts or proposals for sort of an underground network, they're really impossible. I mean, you really are tying yourself up into possible criminal liability. I've heard people propose, I want to set up a website that will connect people seeking abortions to people who will help them. And my first instinct is, I really think you need to consult some lawyers here, because we have a whole generation of folks who've lived under Roe, and they just are not thinking through all of the implications here, because I think in some states it's legal, and that means that as long as they're living physically in that state, they're fine. And the answer is much more complicated than that. And so, you have the kind of uncertainty that Marianne brings up. It's this melding of two worlds where you have the sort of digital life that we live with literal physical consequences for people who may be in domestic violence situations, may simply have nosy neighbors and spiteful communities who are trying to target folks that they think might be seeking reproductive health care. And all of that is pretty concerning.
I would say too that the uncertainty created by these statutes, in my view, is most certainly a feature and not a bug. This is intentional. It's intentionally confusing. And if scholars and lawyers can't figure out how these various laws are interacting with each other, for example, pre-Roe laws, trigger laws, newly enacted laws, which one is paramount? If we can't figure that out, how would any individual in a given state figure that out? And if you're going to protect yourself, whether you're a provider or a person who can become pregnant, who is contemplating your options, and you're worried, and you think, I don't know what the rules are, you're going to err on the side of caution. And for providers, that's going to be not providing care. And for individuals, that's going to be not doing internet searches about how I should care for my body in this particular situation. So the chilling of that intellectual endeavor, right, to even research, to find out information. Imagine if you're a 15-year-old girl in Mississippi and you find that you're pregnant, right? We hope you know why you're pregnant. And if you do know, and maybe you think, I don't know what my options are, what's the first thing anyone with a phone is going to do? Go online and do a search. And that very act can now bring you in the crosshairs of surveillance investigation and be used against you. I think the uncertainty is a real problem. And I think if people were honest about their intent, if they wanted to make these statutes clear and understandable, they most certainly could do so.
Or to follow up on your HIPAA, right? You're a 15-year-old and you're wondering these things on your school-issued laptop, and your school has some software to look for certain kinds of search terms, and you have no idea because you're 15 years old.
What kind of self-help things can people do? I mean, to some extent, I think, there's a bit of a hopelessness right now, and that there's not much that can be done. And certainly we need policy solutions. And even those are limited because, in states that do want to do something, it's not clear what the extent of their power to do that is. There really is very little precedent for this. I mean, the only kind of precedent I can think really is pre-Civil War. And the issues of the North and the northern and southern states, and that conflict over slavery. Beyond that, I really don't know where there are really good precedents to give any clarity to all this. But are there things that companies can do, such as maybe purging all their data much more routinely, that individuals could do, tools that could be available? I'm wondering if there's anything that, if a company wants to do something, or people push companies to do something, what should they do?
I do think that limiting the information being gathered and then being held to begin with is a really important thing to look at, because, as you write about, Dan, this whole notice and consent, the idea that they have choice is a little bit of a fiction. And so to really put the onus on companies themselves to not gather everything just because they can, not keep it just because they can, I think that's a very important way to kind of stop the pipeline at the outset to some extent.
And I think too, not engaging in kind of performative measures. That is, companies, when Google will say, we're not going to keep certain information about location or reproductive health, they're not doing it though vis-a-vis search. They're not doing it vis-a-vis all of their applications. And so to me, that's just, it's just like when Silicon Valley companies were saying, we'll fly you to a jurisdiction where, you can avail yourself of reproductive health. And of course, the next question is, well, I feel like aiding and abetting statutes are, primed for revisiting in these 12 states where abortion is illegal, right? And so that is complicated too. But I feel a little disappointed, right? And Dan knows this. Many of you know this about me. I'm an anti-collection person. You cannot exploit it if you do not have it, right? You ought not collect it, right? You cannot leak it or hack it or sell it, right? If you do not have it. And I think, I wish my watch was still dumb. It is actually still pretty dumb. But, that is, we use these tools and services that have transformed themselves into surveillance devices, and they don't have to. Right. And so, I guess that's, all of us together sort of pressing these companies to not take the baloney, like half measure where they get the pat on the back. Oh, thank you. You're going to delete that from X part of your business, but not elsewhere. And then we just need to press them, bring moral suasion to the fore, and press them to meaningfully minimize and not collect, because they're making us safer. They're enabling us to, as Jolynn was underscoring, the capacity, feeling free to search, right? At that 15-year-old, right? We want that 15-year-old to be able to do that. And all the pathologies that Elizabeth talked about in the criminal system are going to, like those gears of consent, all that's going to come into play, right? And we just want to prevent any information so that we don't even start that process, right? At least by my lights.
And I would add to their encryption. Companies should provide privacy by default. So first of all, encryption, end-to-end encryption, use Signal as opposed to text messaging that's just available to anyone. And communications are so important, because women in these situations, people who can become pregnant in these situations, you want to encourage those people to have important, meaningful, thoughtful conversations with people who care about them, about the choices they're going to make. And those communications should be protected. It should be end-to-end encryption. Flow, for example, one of the femtech apps, added an anonymized option after Dobbs, which is great. That's a great move. Have that be the default. Don't make it something somebody's got to do 15, 20 different screens to even locate. Have that be the default, and then have people have to take that extra affirmative step to share more, understanding maybe with a little more information about what risks that might entail. But anytime we can get companies to do privacy by default, and I understand I am dreaming really big right here, and that this is not likely to happen, but this is something that I think should happen, privacy by default.
One thing that this brings to mind is that case that was reported on, I believe it was 2012, where Target had a sophisticated algorithm, and then from people's buying patterns could determine that they were pregnant very early on in their pregnancy, and even before they started buying baby products. And that means now we are 10 years beyond that, and the computing power and the sophistication of the algorithms and the inferences that they can make mean that even if people don't disclose on any app or don't use an app to disclose this information, that the intimate privacy information can be inferred by just various casual data and buying patterns. Apparently, the Target was able to figure this out by that they figured out a pattern that that pregnant women would buy unscented soaps, but they didn't think that they would trigger all this, and that now these companies would know that. And so that means essentially that it's not enough just to focus directly on this information, but to also focus on inferences that could be made about this information, and to protect that, which goes to all information gathered. It just shows that the dramatic scope of the challenge here.
Another example, Dan, that is a little even less techie. There's a man who was interested in his wife's Fitbit data, and was concerned about her high heart rate, and mentioned something about it on a website. I'm not even sure, it's like Nextdoor or something like that. And then everybody responding to him said, well, she might be pregnant. We think she's pregnant. So it's the algorithms might be your neighbors.
I love that line, but I find it interesting too how this kind of brings us almost full circle to this question of how do you incentivize companies to do any of this, right? We began sort of talking about the 230 issue and how the most devastating thing about it, I think, is that it gave us the inverse of what it was supposed to, right? Rather than offering incentives for people to behave better with how much power they were going to have as gatekeepers, it has actually told them that, look, you can either behave badly or behave well, and you're going to get the same outcome. That is, and it's not even a draw though, because we know you behave badly, there's money there, right? And interventions are costly. So we're now, all these things are wonderful. I love the idea of no default, of the default no collection, default just being everything should be opt-in. Where is the incentive going to come in for these companies to act this way? And that's what I'm really concerned about, because I think now we do have a moment that could be a market moment to say, the products coming on the market now that could offer that, I think this is their time. But until these other companies that don't do that start to hurt, right? Until they start to have to internalize some of those consequences, I think we've just got a human behavior problem here, which is that moral hazard of, yeah, it's screwing everybody over, but not the companies themselves. We've been talking about the chilling effects and how we're worried about what will happen if we don't know about the law. What do we do for the industry? We tell them every time you're nervous, we'll just take care of you. Don't ever worry about it. So I think we're really going to have to think hard about how we shift those incentives to, especially for the most powerful actors in this space, which are largely these tech companies.
I don't think there's a dearth of ideas. I think it's really a matter of, there's incentivizing companies is important, but, national legislation is always the easiest way to deal with these problems. And the silence here, of course, or the inability to do anything about it, of course, is really telling who is worthy of protection and who isn't. And I think that's really the bottom line for me.
I'll throw in, I know we're almost out of time, but I will throw in one thing that I think could happen more often. And it's not for lack of, it's not for malice that this is happening, but I think we'll see a number of times engineers designing apps and products using software development kits that are provided for Facebook login or Google Analytics, Facebook Analytics, something like this. Not necessarily recognizing, and there's no reason they necessarily would, about the data flows that using those SDKs creates. And how, okay, I'm going to put a metapixel on my, my hospital website, and that's sending information back to Facebook. Did the engineers recognize that? Maybe, maybe not. But having your privacy people come together with your engineering people at a much earlier stage in the development to understand what might we be importing with these SDKs, and how are the ways that we code events, etc., for an app going to cause data to flow from us over there in ways we maybe didn't even anticipate. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's something that I think people could look at more carefully.
Well, thank you all for a fascinating conversation. I wish we had more hours to keep going. If you're interested in these issues, I've listed in the on the site here some of the writings that you all have done. I recommend everything. I think that they're all worth reading and fascinating pieces. So definitely look to read some of the scholarship by this great panel. And of course, you can start by buying Danielle's book. It is a wonderful book. It should be on everybody's bookshelf. I think it's fantastic. So definitely go out and get a copy of this. Thank you all for joining me and sharing all your fascinating thoughts with all of us. So thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.